All right. Hey,
I was
everybody.
ready to drop my phone.
David was ready, but now he's ready again. Hey, thank you for joining us today on Do the Work. We're going to be digging into a practical investigation in strengthening our approach to adult Bible studies. Each of the different demographic segments of a Bible study concept and strengthening understanding of God's Word has some advantages and weaknesses that we have to kind of break out at times. And I know I've mentioned this before. As a young evangelist and a young teacher, adult Bible classes were thrilling and terrifying at the same time. And at least for me, the first year and a half of doing it, I'm quite certain that I put the brethren in those classes through more pain than gain. And so we brought David Dan in to talk to us a little bit about his experience as well. I've known David for a long time. He has always been, and since I've known him, an excellent teacher of the scriptures. He is now also a very competent teacher of adult Bible classes, an excellent evangelist as well. David, how you doing? He's
Doing
smiling.
good,
You doing all
man.
right?
Doing good.
Yeah. He's
Yeah,
not
doing
handling the
great.
praise well, I don't think. David, it's great to have you with us. We're going to break it down in a process of three areas that we both think will be effective in the big sense. That really will kind of help us have a better appreciation of how we can be successful in teaching in this manner. And so we've got some goals of edification. We've got a secondary goal of participation and a tertiary goal of application. In those goal models, we're going to certainly also address some of the other tools that we can bring into play to make these things effective. Because we need, at least from my perception, and David can disagree or agree, we need to make sure that we invest in growing the adults that are part of a congregation, because that creates the garden for all the other parts. If you want strong, spiritually minded kids, they don't exist without parents who are really participating in the bigger spiritual realm. And so, David, let's get right into the heart of it and start to talk more in depth about edification. And so when you think about edification, we'll get to my theories in a second. When you think about edification for an adult Bible class, what are you trying to accomplish to get there? What are you trying to make happen?
Well, the first thing is that I guess all of this is about preparation, right? You as a teacher, you have to know what you're trying to accomplish going into this. You have to have some clear goals in mind. So you're not just going in and thinking, well, I'm going to talk about, some facts, or I'm going to, do some lecturing on some interesting thing that I've studied this week. But you have a goal in mind. You're trying to bring people to understand a certain scriptural concept or a passage or something that is biblically important for them to grasp. And so that's where I think it begins, is with that preparation in mind, that I have something here that I'm trying to accomplish, and I'm not just trying to fill time or, further some curiosities or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's powerful to at least for me, when I learned this, I teach better when I have a long-term look of what's coming next. And I've broken down individually, even if it's a 13-week series, what I want to accomplish in each of those weeks. That I have very specific, I want to know, I want to teach, I want to show goals. And so the outlines that I use include that, although they are very often, because I like to teach more expository classes than topical classes. I want to stay as much as I can in the text. I'm breaking down the nitty gritty of the history of that particular verse in a very structured and detailed and sometimes overly laborious way, but that's not my goal. My goal is not to turn everyone into textual critics who know every single jot and tittle of a sentence as it's translated into English. I have a different goal in mind, generally speaking. I want them to know if it's the Old Testament, how can they build their hope? How does this story build hope, a la Romans 15:4. I want them to get hope from this section. Or how did God want worship engaged in? So I lay those out, and like often at the top of my page for my notes or in my digital notes, that goal repeats itself on every page. It'll say, this is the big thing. This is the main point. And so I'm trying to lead to that. Because as we talked before, edification in part is interwoven with admonition and exhortation. They're not independent ideas, but they kind of are pushed along by admonition and exhortation in different ways. The trajectory kind of helps them inch to that destination. So with your preparation wise, like let's say I'm going to tell you, hey David, you're going to teach Genesis to the high school class in 12 months, because that's how long I want to know in advance. 6 months is okay too. I'd prefer to have at least that long to get ready for a great class. What's going to be the first things you pull off your bookshelf to say, after I've read the text again, I've read Genesis all the way through a couple times recently, maybe I've got my outline put together, what do I build on top of that to select goals to meet these adults? And I'm saying high school class, those are young adults. I consider them adults with less world experience at this point for my teaching models. So what are your go-to standards?
And I think that just to quickly piggyback off of that point you just made about the young adults or high school students or whatever it may be, I think that that's a key thing to not forget, is that when we're teaching a typical adult Bible class in a congregation, or even if it's a small group study or even a one-on-one study, most of the time what we're doing is we're teaching at a level that would be kind of like maybe 8th grade or so level. So we're not thinking, okay, I'm teaching a bunch of guys who've been preaching 40 years. And we may be in a situation like that occasionally, but most of the time from week to week, we've got to make this so that it is at a level where everybody can grasp and participate and understand what's going on. And so with varying levels of education, we've got to kind of find that mean of about an 8th grade level probably most of the time. But
right,
with that in mind.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no.
No, go ahead. What's your first steps? What's your first steps to grab? Like with all that in mind, like you're going to your bookshelf, you've got yours organized by alphabet and by subject. Mine's organized by color. You go to your bookshelf,
right.
You pull it off. Do you get the blue books or the red books?
So I'm thinking, okay, what's going to edify this class is going to be the orange books over here on the shelf. It's just
okay. What are your?
It feels
orange
very
books?
old today. Yeah, with your crayon method of organization. So what I do with those kinds of studies, and like you, I want to do the textual studies. I want to do the expository classes. Pick a book of the Bible, like you're talking about with Genesis. So what I would do after, of course, reading through it, as you already mentioned, would be to back up and take a big picture kind of approach, so that we don't get lost in the details. We don't even get lost in a chapter or a particular passage, but backing up and saying, okay, what is the overall message of this book? What are the main key themes of this book? And always backing up to that, and then launching from there into how we're going to break this down, and never losing sight of that overall picture. To me, that's one of the most important things as we begin. So try to get a grasp on the overall theme and don't lose that, don't leave that, but keep circling back around to that in every part of the study and every passage that's used in the study.
Yeah, a lot of times in order for me to do that, because I tend to see things in a visual way, in a thematic way, I'll get out a piece of paper and create, sometimes it looks like a conspiracy theory board of the interactions of a particular Old Testament book as it connects to the prophets, Like as an example, Deuteronomy is one of the richest quotation sections of the Old Testament. A lot of the principles in Deuteronomy appear in the prophets. Deuteronomy gets quoted a lot by Jesus, and so right now we're teaching Deuteronomy at Eastside, and so I've got listings upon listings of where does it get used, because in part, and this is my tool that I grab first. How does the Bible interpret the Bible? How did Jesus and the prophets apply a passage? What was their big goal? That often eradicates misunderstandings on my side for what the building up value is of a text. Like if I've made mistakes in my understanding, Jesus corrects me. Isaiah corrects me. Malachi corrects me because they've looked at the old law and then they made a core shift and said, okay, no, it's right here. This is the big thing, and this is the powerful application truth. So I often do that same thing. One of the things I do is if I know how well enough in advance that I'm going to be teaching a book, a particular Old Testament book, New Testament book, I'll also make sure I'm very well read from the best quality commentators I can find. And quality doesn't mean new; it just simply means quality. I want them to be challenging. I don't want them to 100% agree with me because I want to be forced to concretely possess a strong understanding of various views. And I only accomplish that if I challenge myself by someone who's good at it on the other side. And I use that loosely because it's more about a spectrum, is more realistic with commentaries. And so I'm going to make sure, like if I'm teaching Genesis, as we're going to use as our illustrative tool, I'll probably have read 10 books recently on Genesis, not just commentaries, but of various levels, but people making application from Genesis, maybe some podcasts, maybe some A&E history podcasts, stuff like that. That gives me a richer view of what's going on. And folks who are really expert in archaeology, I might call them and talk to them. Or if their expert is ancient Near East religions, I might call them and talk to them. If they write good Bible class material like you do, I might call them and say, how do you approach teaching this chapter? Because it's weird. This chapter is weird. It doesn't flow like the other chapters. And some chapters in the Old Testament are just simply weird, which I think you would probably agree to. They have a strange layout based on what we're used to. We're accustomed to being taught a certain way in American culture. And so you've got to stop and throw that to the back. So that's one of the things that I try to do in advance. And the longer I have ahead of time, the richer that podium can be that I can stand on. That lectern can be stronger to lean on. And, I've been doing this for a lot longer too. So.
Well, and seeing how other people have done it, right? Not that necessarily I'm going to do it the exact same way, but, looking at, okay, how have others approached this? How have others done this? Just to, like you're saying, get a broad view of what has been done and what's out there and how I can incorporate the best of that into what I'm going to do. And really, you think about different books of the Bible as we're talking about teaching books of the Bible, and never losing sight of the theme. We have the theme of the whole Bible, God's plan of redemption through Christ. We always have to keep that front and center. And then how this book that I'm teaching relates to that overall theme, and then what the particular point is of this book, because every book has a point. If I'm teaching Hebrews, the main theme there is that Christ is better, right, than the old covenant, better than Moses, better than anything else or anyone else. And here this is being written to exhort these Hebrew Christians so that they don't go backwards and go back to Judaism and leave behind what they've got that is better than that. And so, while there are very good passages in Hebrews that we can take in isolation, what we need to be doing is taking everything under the umbrella of that theme as we move through it. And the same would be true of Genesis. When you think about the promises that God made to Abraham and then the outworking of that, never losing sight of the big picture. This is what we're working on as we go along here, instead of just, hey, this is an interesting story. let's talk about this, or here's a neat point, here's an interesting verse. We've got to see how it all fits together in order for that edification to really take place.
Let me leverage this as we can slip into our next subject, which is participation here. A great thing to do as early as you can in your preaching is to start preaching a sermon that focuses on one book of the Bible. Preach a Genesis sermon, a Leviticus sermon, a Deuteronomy sermon. There's some great benefits to it. One young preacher, you now have 66 sermons ready to go, topically laid out, like, because they are. Each of those books have a topic. Secondly, you'll approach the book differently when you're preaching on it in a single sermon setting than you would in an extended format. So you've got to pay attention to the high points, and you're forced to compress ideas in a consolidated message that says, here it is in a tighter format. You're going to have to work a lot harder to preach Genesis in one sermon than you are if you're going to teach it in 26 classes. And so
Right.
that's a tool that you can use. And then you can do this. You can learn it. Now we can talk about participation, because participation is a hard thing to manage as a Bible class teacher. Every teacher I know says that they want participation, but I don't know what your visiting history has been like. But when I visit other congregations, participation is all over the map. In some places, the guys are basically giving a second sermon. And if you raise your hand, they don't even notice that it's taken place. And other places, it seems like there's no structure, no preparation, and if you don't participate, there's no class. So how do we use preparation to produce participation in a healthy way? And we'll talk a little bit in a second about the curveball guy that loves to try to get you off your heels a little bit. So what are some of your big tips for that?
This to me is so very important, this participation aspect. When we think about the goal of learning and edifying, like you said, you can go in and somebody's lecturing and you raise your hand, doesn't see it, and there's no interaction. I've had situations where, hearing complaints, people just don't participate in this class, or, people don't speak up. Well, a lot of that is because of the way it's being taught, or it's because of the teacher and the teacher's approach. And that can change very quickly and very easily. And the thing that I look at, of course, Jesus is the master teacher. And you look at the way that Jesus taught, he asked questions, constantly asking questions. And of course, the first rule of that is to understand you don't ask a question you don't know the answer to if you're teaching, right? Christ always knew the answer. Yeah, he knew everything. He knew the answer. He wasn't asking for information, but he was asking questions as a teaching style in order to promote thought and to promote growth. And so, you look at, for example, in Matthew chapter 22, where you have the series of debates there at the temple, and questions are being asked of Jesus, and then finally they don't want to question him anymore. But at the end of that chapter, he poses the question in his teaching, right, about himself being the son of David and also being the Lord of David, and he poses that question to the listeners. And you look at that, and that's just one example. But what that's doing is provoking thought, provoking a response, and provoking participation. That's what we have to do. That's what we have to model ourselves after as Bible teachers. And what happens is, if we're not careful, that we're busy. If we do ask questions, they can be the what questions, right?
Yeah.
Or the where questions, right?
What, where, why,
Instead
when?
of
Those are
the
the
why and the how questions.
right.
Sorry, what did you say?
Oh, yeah. Well, the why and the how questions have their basis, but they only exist on the foundation of the what and the where. You can't answer a why if you have no idea where you're at and what God is talking about. And I think about this too, and this is like a practical thing. If you asked a question, give them time to respond and be comfortable with emotional silence. On radio broadcasts, even on our thing here, we don't want dead air. That's not a healthy thing. It's like people turn off the radio when there's no noise. In a Bible class, you can ask a question, and if you want to force conversation, you have to be able to willing to wait for it to arrive. Because if you didn't tell them ahead of time and give a written question sheet for them to be prepared for, that had that question on it, they haven't thought about it yet. And so they have to
Right.
have time to, what's the answer to that? Well, they're going to have to go through all the things that you did to get ready to answer that question, but you're making them do it in 30 seconds, and you took 2 hours to answer the question. And
Yeah.
so it's really important
And
to be
let's
okay
not
with
let's
that.
not skip over that, right? That's an important point when we think about preparation, that we are putting out material and we are encouraging the members of the class to prepare ahead of time and answer the questions that we're given. And if we're writing our own material, we're writing those good questions, those how and why questions, to get them to think and to come to the class prepared so that we can all benefit. We have to set that expectation that that's the way it's going to be going into the class in order to get
Yeah.
those kinds of results.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to be, if we're looking for a particular wording of a question. Hal Hammond's brought in a comment asking about, how he struggles with folks who are looking for a particular worded answer or a specific answer in mind, and then we give them a different answer, and they just kind of ignore, the teacher ignores what we've offered up as, hey, have you thought about where Jesus says this as
Right.
an answer to your question? As a teacher, we have to be open to people disagreeing with us and do so in an agreeable way so that they want to ask the
Mhm.
next question. Because if we don't do that, they won't learn and neither will we. And hi, Neil.
Yeah.
Neil Timberlake says hello. So
We have to be able to be flexible, right? On the one hand, we're not up there playing the guess what I'm thinking game, right? With our questions. Guess what the
yeah,
teacher's thinking? No, we're looking at the text and we're drawing that how or that why question out of what's there in the text. So they can look at the text and see, okay, here's how you get from point A to point B. And then at the same time, aside from not playing the guess what I'm thinking game, we're also, as you were talking about just a minute ago, we're giving them time to prepare ahead of time, hopefully for this. But we're also, how did you word that? What was the text question you said you got? Was the
just
issue
like
there with
Hal mentioned, he
being able
wrote it
to
this
field
way.
questions?
Yeah, Hal says it this way. I am turned off when a teacher asks a what question to which he has a very specific answer in mind. He gets all
Yeah.
sorts of
Okay.
answers that are completely defensible, but he brushes them off as lesser or even inaccurate because it wasn't his answer. So I just summarized that down, but that's what Hal was talking about.
Okay. Yeah. So here's an example, right? Okay. So in Genesis chapter 12, when God tells Abram to leave the land of his fathers and go to a land that he will show him, what do you think Abraham was thinking, Phil?
Yeah,
And Phil
that's
gives his answer,
yeah,
right? No, Phil, that's not it, right? That's not what
yeah,
Abraham was thinking there. Let me tell you what my answer is. Okay. What we've just done there is we have shut down participation and interaction and
yeah,
thought, really, right? So we have to be able, first of all, it's not a great question to ask. But the thing is, we have to be able to field questions that may be different from what we've thought of in a
yeah,
flexible manner, right? And give everybody the benefit of the doubt that here we're trying to come to an understanding. Okay, well, I can see where you maybe thought about that and come up with that answer, and that may relate in some way, but let's also think about this. And there are ways that we can handle that in a way that leads to edification instead of in a way that leads to a shutdown. And then
yeah,
everybody else is sitting thinking, I'm not going to answer a question now. Look what happened to him, right?
yeah. Every congregation you're part of is going to have somebody who we'll call Curveball Carl, who uh, loves to try to keep the teacher on his toes, and they're invested into the idea. They may not even know they're doing it, Some people use the terminology, which I completely deplore in a Bible class, which is, well, someone has to play the devil's advocate. I don't like that
Right.
terminology in a Bible class. I know what they're talking about, but the principle isn't healthy.
No.
It is not our job to argue in advance of things that are wrong. We can explore them and present them and say, this is a false idea that's held, and here's why it's false, and we can do that in a very healthy way. But curveball
Yeah.
Carl shows up all the time. Um, I'll talk about from my perspective. You can jump in a second. I like to give curveball room to throw the pitch, and I try to catch it and then give myself a little moment of time to figure out what I'm going to say in response. Now, that's a struggle. And I'll talk about the struggles for folks to kind of process through. The first layer for me is I need to make sure that I'm not giving nonverbal agreement or disagreement to the curveball. And that's hard because I have learned that my thinking face looks a whole lot like my angry face, according to my kids. They can't see the
You're an
difference
angry
between the
thinker.
two. I'm an
You're an
angry
angry
thinker.
thinker.
That's it. Um, you know, Jay Taylor comes back with his response to curveball Carl. And says, let's talk about that at lunch this week. And that's a great principle to bring in too. But I wanted to have a time to process it. Maybe the curveball is the right ball to hit out of the park. Maybe he slowed it down enough where that's where I could hit my home run. And I can make the application I was looking for. And he's actually given me the fodder to meet my goal. How do you approach curveball? How do you approach Carl? We all have a Carl in our life. You've got a
Well,
particular
yeah.
Carl I'm
I mean,
thinking about.
yeah, you've got your guys that think it's their job to play stump the preacher or to second guess everything the preacher said. Hopefully, in our preparation, we have studied enough, we've prepared enough to where we can anticipate most of that kind of thing and the different angles that somebody might come from, especially if this is something that we've become accustomed to. But what we have to recognize is that when you've got that going on, if it's going on repeatedly, that's something that needs to be addressed outside the class, right? That here,
Yeah.
this brother needs to understand you're creating an environment where learning is not going to take place. Come back to what our goal is here. What are we trying to accomplish? So that needs to be a conversation that has to happen at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later. But then the other thing is, and I think this might be the text you got there or the message you got there, that sometimes, I mean, there's nothing wrong if this is going on to say, look, we can pick this up, the two of us, let's get together later this week. We're not going to derail the class to address this because that's not what we're focused on right now. There are answers to your question. We can get together and talk about that on our own time, but we're going to focus on what we came here to talk about and discuss in this class. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes it just needs to be put off until later in a more appropriate situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some principle of making sure you stay on task because participation will
Right.
die out if you repeat yourself 2, 3 weeks in a row because you keep getting drugged down the rabbit hole. And by the way,
Yeah.
the teacher can do that too. The teacher can pull
Mhm.
you can pull yourself into the rabbit hole in the sermon, in the Bible class, and all these places too. So make sure that you plan well how to navigate that and learn ahead. And this connects to another thing we didn't talk about in the edification realm. We can talk about it here. It's really important to learn the group you're trying to grow. To know a bit about them allows you to teach them more effectively. So like this guy's going to ask these kind of questions. I need to be ready to answer those kind of questions. So sometimes in
Right.
my notes, I have very specific responses planned for when X, Y, or Z happens. He's going to bring this up. I think
Yeah.
it's a question that's valuable. Okay, now I'm ready to answer it in a healthier way.
Yeah. And
So
sometimes
that,
you can anticipate that. You can even cut that off before it starts, right? You sometimes in your material you can anticipate. Oh, I think I know where this guy's going to go if he raises this point. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut that off by presenting material on that ahead of time, and then we'll just move on. And he'll sit there and he won't have anything to say because I've already answered the question that he wanted to ask. And
Yeah.
so you can kind of move through it that way too if you're familiar enough with the kinds of things that come up.
Yeah. The old nip that in the bud as early as possible methodology.
Yes.
So that drives us to something that's really important. I'm going to use an illustration from someone who I know you know, which is Connie Adams. He taught me this years ago. Um, you can be the very best artist in the planet, drawing the picture of a swine, and you've got the best rendition of Charlotte the Pig ever on the board. And it's got all of the musculature, all of the physical form, but sometimes in order to drive the point home, after you draw the picture of the pig, you got to write PIG underneath. You have to make the specific, concrete, intended application because even with the best artists, some people don't make the connection between what you're talking about and what is relevant in the spiritual challenges of their life. And that's an important principle when we start talking about making application. And I'm going to put a little bit of a limiter on, at least for myself. Any application that I'm going to make from a Bible passage is going to be first relevant to the initial preaching of that particular Bible passage. The old shotgun concordance method of bringing every Bible passage that mentions the word you have in mind doesn't actually help, even though I will tell you that almost every young preacher I know has a shameful sermon in their back pocket that they preached using the old shotgun concordance methodology. It doesn't help in Bible classes, doesn't help in sermons. Try to stop doing that as soon as you can. So for application,
use the passage. Use the correct passage that makes that application in order to make the application. Yeah.
Yeah, and I
What we're
use this
talking
illustration.
about.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you do your illustration.
Well, my illustration comes from Cana, from the wedding at Cana in John chapter 2. That is not the passage to go to discuss whether a Christian should be sober in their demeanor and how they interact with alcoholic beverages. It is the least effective text in having that conversation. Um, you know, beyond that, if I wanted to discuss that, I'd go somewhere else. If I want to talk about the capacity of Jesus to provide and engage in the miraculous work as the Son of God, then John chapter 2 is awesome. But it's not the passage to talk about sobriety. Because if you read it 100 times, you'll notice Jesus doesn't essentially deal with it there. There are ancillary truths, there are interwoven principles, but it's not the text. There's so many better ones. They're like super plain and super obvious. Just because there's wine in the passage doesn't mean that's where you talk about it. So on the application level, what are some principles when we set our goals?
But at the same time, if you're teaching John chapter 2, you better be completely prepared to deal with that question because it's going to come up. So that gets back to what we're talking about. That's not the main focus of the passage, but that's going to come up, and you have to, in your preparation, be ready to effectively discuss and deal with that.
Oh, absolutely. But that's the difference between prepared understanding and prepared goals and prepared applications. Like these are the things that I'm trying to get people to get out of the text. So for me, when I'm laying out my applications, like things that I want to make sure I stress as the principled truths from the text, I want to make sure that I've got some biblical illustrations of it that I can pull into play, where this spiritual ideal is applied in the life of this prophet, of this king, of this disciple. Like if I can do that, that's my first step. Then I can take that illustration and say, and this disciple is you and me, and this prophet is you and me, and this priest is you and me, and this king is you and me, and here's why. Here's where I'm looking for the application level, so that it comes away and say, hey, I'm just like them. I'm part of God's kingdom. I'm a servant of Christ. I'm struggling with the same things, and here's how God showed me how I can overcome or solve or serve in these various ways. By the way,
Yeah.
Neil Tremblett wants us to answer a very important question, so leave a little time for that. We've got a significant Neil question to answer here in a second.
Okay, the answer to Neil's question, which I have not seen, is that the social and recreational drinking of intoxicating drink is ruled out by many other passages besides John chapter 2. So I hope that answers the question.
Wow, because when you hear the question, you're going to be really intrigued about how you gave that answer. Because I'm going to try to tie those that together.
What we're talking about is the transformational aspect of this, right? We're not just engaging in an academic things like that. We're trying to get down to being doers of the word, not hearers only aspect of this. How this is going to change my life now that I've been in this class, now that I've heard these things. What is this doing for me in my relationship with the Lord? That's what we have to come down to in the application part of this. And like you're talking about, that means making it personal.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Because in the end, those interactions on a personal level of practical faith really have the largest impact on our big goals, which is an application of Romans 12:1-2, be ye not conformed, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. The practical side of Jesus instructing his disciples, the manner in which you demonstrate your love for one another is testimony that I am the Son of God in essence, and that's part of the bigger picture of these expectations. So I'm going to kind of summarize a couple of things. We're getting close to our intended goals for this conversation here. We've made some preparations and plans there. When we're getting ready to teach an adult Bible class, we need to take some time to lay out in preparation how we can edify the participants. How can we make them grow spiritually? Secondly, we want to make sure that we engage in a participatory way. That means responding, the question gets asked, even if they're coming from Curveball Carl, in a healthy way. And then in the end, when someone walks out, they have some takeaways from the 45 minutes, from the hour, from the 2 hours, from whatever we've invested in that Bible study, that they can then use profitably in the kingdom. Even if it's just a greater understanding of what God's doing, they've got to take something away from the study other than, well, I'm tired. I think a lot of times, due to the failure of teachers, we wear out people's bodies instead of helping them grow into greater spiritual service. Now, I'm going to tell you Neil's question real quick. So you already gave your answer to Neil's question. His question was, like to get your thoughts on Canadian guys. And so,
that's kind of an open-ended question.
I'm just going to go with your answer being the exact answer to his question.
I think I'm going to have to let my answer stand because that's such an open-ended question, such a big can of worms to open.
Right. I'll add in a couple of derogatory remarks to bagged milk on top of that. That bagged milk is awful. Bagged milk is horrible. Milk should come in a jug or a carton, and that's the lawful way to engage in the drinking of milk, which, by the way, is not an intoxicating beverage for anyone who has a question. Let me add a couple more things.
So
We've got just a few more moments.
Let me add this, okay? Let me say this to kind of pull some of this together. When we're talking about teaching a Bible class, okay, we're not talking about, where we read a verse and then we go around the room. What does this mean to you? Oh, that's interesting. What does this mean to you? Oh, wow, I like that. What does this mean to you? We're just it becomes kind of an opinion sharing session. That's not edifying. That's not making the application. We have to have a goal in mind that we're going to grasp the message that God has given us, right? The gospel is the power of God to salvation. Faith comes by hearing the word of God. And so we're looking at what God is saying to us, and we're trying to grasp it and understand it and use it in our lives, and then be able to pass it on to others, which is really the ultimate thing that we're trying to get to here. Is not only am I able to use this now in my life, but now I can turn around and teach this to somebody else and help that person as well. So again, the focus on those things has to always be there so that we don't get lost in the middle of this.
Yeah, to quote one of your favorite presidents, Abraham Lincoln, if you want to figure out what you need to do, you first need to know where you are and where you want to go in order to figure out how to get there. And so with Bible classes, that's what we're doing. We're asking, where is, in this case, the flock of students? Where do we want them to go? If you know those two things and you're teaching through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, etc., you can then chart the pathway. And for young preachers like you and me, when we were less experienced, I'll just say, like I said before,
I thought you meant we still are the young preachers, you and me.
we are in our heads, but realistically, the math tells a different story. And I'll say just for this, me, learned that through experience. We learned some of these processes through training programs that we participated in different ways, college classes, mentorship. The sooner you can grasp how to create a great Bible class environment, the stronger the church can be if they're willing to buy in. And so these are principles that are super important. It's a little bit different than some of the other aspects of preaching and teaching, because a Bible class allows people to give you immediate feedback. Like, if it's not good, everybody knows. And you can't hide it behind great singing, great prayers. It has to come up on the forefront. And so I think in that context and in that little window, if you will, we can then take what would be an average Bible class and make it great with that extra work on the front end. One more tidbit before we close out. Remember, we're talking really about Bible class teaching in the church context, in the congregational context, but the principles are across the board. From a Bible study like David and I had on a plane flight flying from Atlanta to Tampa, with just the two of us, to times where he and I have both been able to teach massive groups, 200, 300 people in the audience. In both of those contrasting, and I say massive, 203 people is a minimal number. We've probably seen teaching that takes place in even larger settings. It just gets harder the larger the group that you're interacting with. Those opportunities need to be utilized well. Souls matter, faith matters, right. Conviction matters. And if we can do those things effectively, we can push against the growing pressure that seems to be pushing people away from connecting well with their brethren in local churches and assembling regularly and growing spiritually. David, do you got anything you're passionate about that you want folks to know about, things that are on your upcoming agenda, maybe gospel meetings, maybe printed work? What's coming out soon out of the pen and prose of David Dan that people need to know about? And do you have a link where they can go find it? Is there a website you want to direct people to? Is there an Instagram page? How keyed are you into the social media world?
I'm actually trying to hide from those that are trying to steal all of our information and our personal data.
They already have it, by the way. It's too late.
Of course they do. Hebronlane.com. You can find material there that I put out and sermons and that kind of thing. And then, of course, books that I've written, adult Bible class books, in bookstores. So there's that.
They sell them in bookstores. I'll give the links down below for those. Right. You can get them at One Stone, you can get them at CI. Some of them are on Amazon. I'll speak for David in that regard because that doesn't touch into his strength box. Hey, everybody who's been jumping in and participating, we love all of you. We love the work that you're doing evangelistically. We want to encourage you to do it better. If we can help, David and I can help, if Terry can help, if others who have been on these video casts and stuff can help, let us know. Send us a message. Send David a message directly. Send it to me.
Give
We'll
us
do our very
feedback.
best. We want the feedback. Feedback makes us better. When the wise men of the Old Testament talk about the interaction of men in regards of it sharpens one another. That's what men do for one another when they're trying to get stronger, is we help through our interactions to do it better the next time because we're hoping for a next time. It's the only way
Mhm.
we improve. That's the only way we grow. One man can sharpen another in that regard. And so if we can help, let us help. If you can help us, help us. David, you have a fantastic day. I'll let you get back to your organized books. It looks like you got one more thing to mention.
Yeah, by the way, your Lincoln quote earlier was from the internet Lincoln with the sunglasses. That's the
I
Lincoln
know.
that quote was from. I wanted to
I know. I
clarify
like
that.
you love that Lincoln. Yeah. I love quoting fake Lincoln for your benefit because it's something you're really passionate about, which is fake Lincoln. Um, but every and I love to produce this face as well. It brings great joy to me is to see a little bit joy in life. Hey everybody, you guys have a wonderful day. If you have opportunity, make sure you read your Bible. Make sure you pray a little bit and sow the seed. If you're worried about the growth of the congregation you're part of, the very best thing you can do is share the gospel with someone. That's how you grow the flock you're part of. See y'all later. Catch us next time.
Thanks.